Hey, all right, so end of the course. Unbelievable, but it's here. So hopefully you're getting caught up with anything that remains outstanding from the course. The only thing that remains is the final exam. The exam's gonna be a lot like the midterm in terms of its structure. You probably had a look already, I guess. I'm mainly here just going to speak real briefly, I guess, about each of those questions. Maybe if you have further things, you can just get in touch with me. Um, but first, I'll just say, for a minute or so, just about the course. Maybe it could seem now, kind of in hindsight, maybe the general drift of the course is clearer than it might have been at any particular moment during. Basically, the idea where we start, we're thinking about oppression, underlying motivation for thinking in feminist terms, thinking about oppression, what that means, how it can go quite deep in terms of knowledge, in terms of the very concepts we use to think about reality. And we also recognize the need to think about it in intersectional terms, which is no easy task, a very important one. We need to do that. And then in the second half, really trying to address just what that might mean, how we can take ideas about experience and so on, and not in the usual way, but in some new and different ways that would be able to enable us to sort of redeem what we mean to do when we try to address oppression in intersectional terms. So a lot of that goes in the direction of some standpoint thinking that we talked about, and how that ultimately kind of was pointing back to a kind of really the political commitment in feminist thinking, basically, that it's not so much about our pre-given identities or anything, but somehow that more forward-looking kind of vision basically provides both a kind of a sense of a new kind of identity, so to speak, but along with that, a new and much improved, basically, take on reality itself. So that's kind of, in a way, what feminist philosophy, I think, has to offer, sort of the broader project of feminism and feminist political action and so on, basically, a critical analysis, especially at these levels of epistemological issues, which is where really a lot of things happen, basically. A lot of the fundamental issues and so on point back to things at that level. So hopefully, anyway, we've touched on some of the things at the end quite quickly in terms of some of the political upshot. That would be for another course. It'd be a very good course, too. But for now, we'll kind of just sort of leave it at that, but just see how these different approaches, these deep questions of knowledge, basically, and how we construe and take up and analyze the social reality around us when we want to do that in the right kind of critical feminist sort of way, that it has some of these kinds of implications, which it stands to reason that maybe they're a little harder to grasp sometimes, right? It's always easy just to go with the usual standard conventional answers, but all of that is bound up with the problem. And, it's kind of unfair, but it's the way it is, that when you want to take a more critical and progressive view on things, it usually does mean a little bit harder work, basically, precisely for that reason. So with the final then, there's a bunch of questions, and most of them, I think, in one way or another, can be fairly closely related to the kind of thing I was just kind of talking about, this overall sense of the course, basically a new way of understanding just how our experience and knowledge fits together with the broader project of feminism, basically. So, for example, the first one here is the question about Oksala, basically. There's a quote there. You want to try to explain that. Keep in mind, remember, that Oksala did not completely disagree with Joan Scott. Right? Joan Scott's main claim was that experience was, not ever to be taken at face value, right? It always needed to be explained and so on. You couldn't explain things in those terms. You certainly couldn't take it as a foundation. All of which may be well taken, but Oksala probably does one better when she says, yeah, but still, right, experience is necessary, especially because, sort of considered intersectionally, there are very important differences there. So we don't need to turn to experience to find a foundation. And whenever we think about something like a foundation, this is usually pretty close to ideas about essences and so on that we always want to steer clear of, right? because we always sort of end up simplifying things and not paying attention to the complexity of concrete reality. But we can pay attention to different kinds of experiences just in order, really, to avoid, right, falling into those kinds of traps, and making it clear that what really needs to be done is to work out something new, right, on that basis, recognizing that, yes, okay, sexist oppression of women could be what we're focused on. This can sort of take any number of different forms because of intersectional factors. We need to grapple with this so we can take up experience on all those different ways, right, and proceed on that basis. We don't find our answer there, but we use it to move forward to something new. So that's, again, the idea about working out some kind of new, A, sense of reality, and then B, our kind of identity, the identity of, kind of who we might be as advocates of feminism, basically. So that kind of, you could relate that to some others there, but that's probably, have that kind of in mind, that the idea that experience still is important, but in a new and different way, right? We don't just take it at face value. She agrees with Scott about that, but it can still play such an important role into making sure that we don't fall into those traps of kind of taking up any sort of, pre-given, identities and so on that may, in fact, be somehow or other complicit with the system that we are opposed to. And in ways that may not be immediately apparent, but maybe when you turn back, it seem much, much clearer. When you think about Collins and the second question here and what she said about standpoints and so on, relates very well there to Oksala, basically, kind of working out different standpoints. Standpoints are never simply reflections of lived experience. They can't be, right? They are, in a way, a theoretical construction, which can make it sound kind of abstract, but the idea is it's supposed to be developed in kind of, a close responsiveness with experience, but in order to work out something that is politically useful, and in particular for being able to enter into coalitions, with other groups, other standpoints, right, in order to form a kind of broader unity that, points forward in the sense of overcoming sexist oppression, basically. So that would sort of work fairly well there. Works out well there in terms of the idea, that was basically there in Oksala. We see it even more clearly in others, just this idea about how it is we shape that sort of progressive identity across difference. I mean, that's the sort of the crucial thing that we're kind of working around here from different angles. So it was the next question, basically, question 3, basically, there's a disjunction. You can choose one of those. They have to do with other questions concerning standpoints. Well, the first one actually is contrasting empiricism, feminist empiricism, with standpoint theory, basically. Basically, especially just work around the idea about how, on the one hand, feminist empiricism can be non-neutral, that is, recognize the need for including, explicitly even, certain kinds of contextual values, social values, that can guide the scientific process in the right direction, basically, while still being impartial, whereas the standpoint approach seems to think, no, we can't really do either. And that's good, right? That we're non-neutral and we're not impartial. That it really kind of matters in terms of the background experience of those in, the work, basically. So that's where we're talking about, like with STEM, for example, whether it matters, explicitly and directly, whether there need to be greater numbers of women, basically, or just overcome the kinds of biases. Standpoint theory points more toward thinking that it really does matter kind of who is in this position. It's kind of just pushing that final bit of a sort of a reflexive scientific critique of the subjectivity itself that's involved in that kind of knowledge. So you can think about that. Intiman has some useful things for sure about that. Question about Harding, basically, you just want to think about that, the contrast, weak and strong, basically. It's thinking that weak, perfectly fine as far as it goes, it just doesn't go far enough, that it's basically oblivious to the kinds of systemic or pervasive social biases like sexist bias that can be present. And a strong objectivity, kind of going to a standpoint approach, is a useful way of bringing that kind of bias to light. And in this way, that's potentially a very effective sort of conceptual, epistemological tool for feminism. And that's her point about this refusal to essentialize. Well, that, again, points back to things we were just saying before in terms of not falling in, basically not allowing even those kinds of implicit bias that are typically operating throughout society, and certainly in any areas of the production of knowledge and so on, or where we come up with what we take to be, a view of reality and so on, just making sure that we don't do that. So, it's very much that spirit even, well, in virtually all these authors probably, but what we were saying with Oksala just a couple of minutes ago, right? Refusing to essentialize, right? There's a connection there with what Oksala was talking about problematizing things, right? We kind of shake things up, we mess things up before we move forward, right? If we don't do that, we're not going to move forward. We're just going to stay with the status quo. Those ideas run deep. They're kind of complicit with the system, so to speak, so we don't sort of shake loose of those and try on our own terms to kind of work out a new understanding of what's going on and just who we are and so on, then we're not going to make progress. The next one, that was from Karastathis, who was quoting somebody else. Differences within us can enable radical alliances among us. As you know, I think that's a lovely quote, a lovely line, basically. Just, I try to explain what that means and so on, just how it is that there is a tendency, and it's well motivated and maybe in certain contexts make a good deal of sense, but still, when it comes right down to it, it is probably mistaken, right? And that is a tendency to think that somehow political coalitions might be stronger when they follow the lines of identity, right? And the problem there is, as we've seen earlier in the course, that's what leads to kind of fragmentation along those very lines. And it seems really hard then to know what becomes of feminism when it crumbles into so many separate struggles along those lines. Is there not sort of a unified focus? You would think there should be, but the idea here is that, the idea that our organizing along lines like that is mistaken, that what we need, well, some sense of identity, but a new one that we work out through this kind of more involved analysis of things, this more kind of nuanced and sophisticated understanding of our intersectional identities, basically, which would lead us to see, right, that really what we mean by identity is so much more complicated. It's not this one simple thing. No one is just one thing. Not even necessarily one thing first and foremost. And that very complexity of individuals can then get reflected at the level of the coalitions that we form, right? And that could be sort of that united front, so to speak, that could be the only way to move forward on the kinds of issues that affect us, basically trying to address oppression in an understood in a complete, inclusive, intersectional way requires precisely that, but it's not the case, that this somehow involves a compromise with identity, but rather actually is in fact a new and deeper, more powerful way of reflecting precisely that. Finally, the last couple of questions. Well, the second last, there's a quote there. We never talked directly about this. It's okay. It's just very general, and you might just, if you read that and if something starts to click, that's great. Go with it, write it out, do something with it. If not, don't worry. Just do some of the other ones. But I just thought that's a nice kind of quote. It might imply that to be a philosopher you have to be a woman. I don't know if that's exactly what she meant or not. You don't have to emphasize that part, but I just think it's a nice way of thinking about feminism philosophy in fairly general terms, if that's appeals to you to do that. And the last question, just something, make up your own, basically. Run it by me if you want. Not a bad idea, just to be sure. You might do the thing, by the way, because I know I mentioned it a couple times and we never really followed through, a question about acknowledgement in Lorraine Code. That's kind of a nice thought, and it relates in nice ways to several other pieces as well. So you might address that. anyways, whatever works, if there's something you really want to talk about there, that could be your opportunity here. I think I have about 10 seconds. So anyway, let me know if you have any further questions about this. I certainly hope you like the course. It's been a weird semester. But any questions, problems, and so on, just get in touch with me.